They called it Krell, the harbinger of starfall, a creature so feared across the galaxy that entire species had rewritten their origin myths just to erase the terror it once brought. Planetary defense networks, imperial fleets, and sentient war algorithms had failed to contain even one of its kind. It was a creature that moved like a sentient black hole, silent, final, and utterly unstoppable. Its mere presence corrupted gravity, bent time, and twisted the minds of those who dared observe it too long. But here's the twist. Humans. They call it Fluffy. The galaxy had long dismissed Earth as a peripheral, barely luminal backwater. Its species, primitive. Its technology, clunky. Its culture, barbaric. But somewhere between the Third Galactic War and the collapse of the Orion conglomerate, something shifted. Humanity stopped being a curiosity and became a galactic enigma. The turning point came during the siege of Mal Theta Prime, a planet fortified by an alliance of 7 apex civilizations, armed to the teeth with kinetic orbital arrays, quantum torpedoes, and psychic null fields. And still, it fell in less than an hour. The cause? Not an armada, not an ancient weapon, but a cargo vessel that had drifted silently through the blockade, bearing a single sealed containment pod. Inside was the Krell, the last known specimen, presumed extinct, banned in every quadrant by 37 galactic treaties, and yet here it was, wearing a red synthetic sweater with a little Earth flag stitched to the side. The broadcast went viral across the StarNet, the human voice, calm, unbothered, echoing over the panicked screams of fleeing soldiers. "Hey, Fluffy, time for walkies." The creature obeyed. It obeyed. Across the stars, silence reigned. Entire councils convened emergency meetings. The Graal High Tribunal issued a Level 0 alert, reserving such classifications only for universe-ending anomalies. And in the dark reaches of the Voldrex abyss, the whisper of an ancient fear began to stir. Humans had turned the galaxy's deadliest predator into a pet. But how? Before we jump into this epic tale, subscribe to StarBoundApex HFY for the most intense sci-fi battles, legendary warriors, and universe-shaking wars. Don't miss out. Hit that subscribe button and join the fight. The truth wasn't in the tech. It wasn't in the weapons or the science or the genetic tampering everyone suspected. No, what made humans so dangerous was something far older, something primal, something no other species had ever needed or feared until now. A strange blend of madness and empathy, of nurturing and domination, of forging bonds where only blood should flow. See, the galaxy had long known war, but only humans knew domestication. Their ancestors had turned wolves into lapdogs, tigers into house cats, and apex avians into decorative cage ornaments. Not through brute force, not through psionics, but through patience, through understanding, through a terrifying cocktail of affection and absolute psychological supremacy. So when the Krell, born in the screaming void between dying stars, met a human zookeeper with a pocket full of beef jerky, it didn't know how to respond. Not really. Its instincts told it to attack. But those instincts had never accounted for someone smiling up at it like it was a misunderstood puppy. And that was where everything began to unravel. Because Earth didn't fear monsters, it tamed them. And the galaxy was utterly unprepared. By the time the Tram Collective realized the scope of the threat, it was too late. Humans had begun collecting, training, bonding. Creatures once considered galactic-level extinction risks were now being walked on leashes in human colonies. The Voro worm, eater of moons, named Squiggles, the mind razor from the Seraph Rift, a child's cuddle pet in Sector 9A. But Krell, that was different. Krell wasn't just powerful, it was sentient. It had memories, hatred, ego, and yet it sat, wagged, and played fetch. At least, at first. Because beneath that trained obedience, something darker was brewing, something the humans didn't see, or chose not to. And in the quiet corners of the stars, others were watching, waiting, wondering what would happen if Fluffy ever remembered what it really was. What happens when a god forgets it's a god, and then remembers? Krell didn't always go by that name. Long before humans labeled it with something as comically benign as Fluffy, it bore a name spoken only in ultraviolet vibrations and gravitational pulses, untranslatable to most sentient minds. In the records of the extinct Dronari archivists, it was called the silence between heartbeats. To the Vahari oracles, it was the one who devours suns without blinking. It was born, not hatched, not constructed, born, in the last epoch of the Stellivore Wars, in a region of space where physics itself had broken down from overuse, a pocket of torn reality, a crucible of failed weaponized black holes, and time rifts stitched together by ancient war machines. From that chaos, Krell emerged, not by design, but by consequence, a living byproduct of galactic genocide. The Krell were never meant to be, but once they were, the galaxy scrambled to unmake them. Empires that had stood for millennia were shattered in months. The chiral swarm, once numbering in the trillions, was erased from history after a single encounter. The surviving gods of the Velicon network voted unanimously to terminate themselves rather than calculate the probability of survival against Krell. It wasn't just a biological entity, it was a dimensional predator. It fed not just on matter, but on order. It unraveled structured reality the way a child tears the wings off a butterfly. And then, it vanished. The galaxy breathed. For 3,000 cycles, there were rumors, hushed speculation, fleeting sensor echoes, and dying prophets who claimed to have seen it sleep. But nothing concrete, nothing that could be weaponized or studied. The Krell became a myth again. Until humans found it. They weren't even looking for it, not really. The story, as leaked from an anonymous source in the Intergalactic Ethics Tribunal, began on a terraforming expedition near the gravitational ruins of Varnek 6. The human crew was cataloging anomalous fauna when they stumbled across a malnourished quadruped with reactive telekinetic properties. That was the first entry in the log. The rest had to be decrypted from shredded emergency beacon fragments. But the video survived. A towering jet-black mass, moving like liquid shadow, approached a lone human technician. The thing pulsed with ambient hatred. Its presence warped the audio. Yet the technician, later identified as Miranda Keys, a junior xenobiologist with a history of behavioral empathy training, stood her ground. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She held out a gloved hand, palm up, and said, "You lost too." The Krell paused, and for the first time in recorded galactic history, it didn't consume. It considered. The rest of the footage was corrupted, but the aftermath was undeniable. A creature capable of gutting dreadnoughts with thought alone was now following the human around like a loyal hound. It didn't obey everyone, only Miranda. And only after a series of interactions that no scientist has since been able to replicate. The best guess: bonding. Human style. Not transactional, not imposed, but something deeper, intuitive, emotional. The same inexplicable force that made wolves become Labradors and raptors perch on extended arms, trusting the untrustable. It terrified the galaxy. Because if humans could tame this, what couldn't they tame? The Kerry Senate called it cultural asymmetry. The Zun Collective declared humans an existential evolutionary anomaly. The Sindari simply issued a single message to all their colonies: avoid Earth, avoid humans, avoid their pets. But not everyone feared them. Some wanted what they had. Black market trafficking rings started stealing Earth-bonded apex creatures. Alien scientists dissected human children trying to reverse engineer the bonding gland. A concept that didn't exist. Spies infiltrated zoos, training centers, even dog parks on Mars and Europa. And somewhere in the cold corridors of an abandoned station orbiting a dying star, a cable was formed. They called themselves the Chain Unbound. Their goal? Not to destroy humanity, but to free Fluffy. Because they believed, no, they knew, that the Arkrell's true purpose had been suppressed. That humanity's training was a leash on something older than time itself. Something divine. And if they could break that leash, they wouldn't just shift the balance of power, they would end it. So while humans laughed at videos of Fluffy chasing drones, wearing party hats, or tilting its head at vacuum cleaners, a deeper plot was already unfolding. One that would pit the galaxy's oldest fear against its newest masters. And if even one strand of that leash were to snap, the stars would bleed. They thought it was just a conspiracy, a fringe belief held by cultists and exiled scholars, those too obsessed with ancient horrors and desperate prophecies. But the Chain Unbound wasn't some scattered sect. It was a coalition of minds, the remnants of failed empires, outcast xenopriests, and forbidden eye fragments stitched together in secret. Their doctrine was simple, terrifying, and blasphemous to some. The Arkrell is not a creature. It is a god, imprisoned. They operated from the shadows, bypassing the pan-galactic surveillance grid through wormhole fragments and cloaked data spheres. For decades, they tracked Fluffy, not through the public feed, but through the echoes it left in the quantum substrate. Each time it blinked, the surrounding laws of physics twitched. Each time it purred, stars in nearby systems dimmed. This wasn't affection. It was containment. The humans didn't realize it, but the emotional bond Miranda Keyes had formed all those years ago wasn't just empathy, it was anchoring. She had grounded an entropy elemental into a mortal shell, wrapping it in something the ancients had no words for: love. And now, she was dying. That's what triggered the chain. They had been waiting, biding their time, gathering forbidden relics and cosmic keys, waiting for the one variable they could not manufacture to decay on its own: Miranda. Her condition was classified. Even the Terran Defense Council didn't fully understand it. Her body wasn't failing from illness, it was unraveling, piece by piece, under the stress of maintaining an emotional tether to something fundamentally wrong for this universe. Physicians tried everything: neural stasis, quantum rejuvenation, even partial clone overlay. But each time they revived her, something within Fluffy stirred. And somewhere, an observatory would collapse, a moon would shatter, or entire digital civilizations would flatline from exposure to emotional radiation. You heard that right. The Arkrell's grief was weaponized emotion, and the Chain Unbound. They saw this not as a crisis, but as a calling. Using a hypertemporal ritual called the Sundering Loop, they began sending pulses into mirrored dimensions, echoing back fragments of what the Arkrell once was, images of its origin, glimpses of its form unbound. The more they learned, the more convinced they became. This wasn't just the deadliest creature in the galaxy. It was the first hunger, an ancient cosmic force buried beneath layers of evolution and time, now trapped inside a pet leash forged from human affection. And humanity had no idea. Back on Earth, Fluffy had become a legend. Statues, holograms, even plush toys. It was the mascot of a generation raised on interstellar peace. Children sang songs about it. Soldiers painted its glowing eyes on their armor for good luck. It had unintentionally become a symbol of human dominance over the unknown. But behind the scenes, Miranda had been placed in a sealed cryochamber aboard the orbital facility Argent Sanctuary, drifting in the Lagrange void between Mars and Jupiter. Fluffy never left her side. It didn't eat. It didn't move. It simply waited. And the galaxy trembled. Because the last time the Arkrell waited, 5 civilizations blinked out of existence without a sound. The Intergalactic Assembly held emergency meetings, debating whether to demand humanity neutralize their pet. But the humans refused. To them, Fluffy wasn't a weapon. It wasn't even dangerous. It was loyal. But loyalty is not the same as obedience. And deep within the abandoned moon lab of Supremacy Prime, the chain made their final move. They weren't going to kill Miranda. No. That would risk a rage spiral that not even a black hole could contain. Instead, they were going to unmoor her, sever the bond not by violence, but by deception. They had stolen a fragment of Miranda's mind, ripped from a failed clone backup during a Terran data breach years ago. With it, they built a psychic echo, a false tether, a trap. Their plan: convince the Arkrell that Miranda had abandoned it, that the one emotion anchoring it to humanity was a lie. The implications were catastrophic. In test simulations, the mere idea of betrayal caused local time to stutter. When the Arkrell dreamed of isolation, entire reality seems flickered. What would happen if it truly felt abandoned? The chain believed it would crack its leash, shed its shell, and return to its original form. And in that form, it wouldn't be fluffy anymore. It would be the end that feeds itself. On the edge of known space, the final piece of the ritual had begun. And as the stars dimmed, Fluffy stirred. Its head rose for the first time in weeks. Its gaze turned toward Supremacy Prime, light years away, and Miranda's heartbeat, usually steady and soothing, flickered. The purring stopped, and the whisper came, carried across every mind, tuned even slightly to the psionic wavelength of reality's edge. She lied. The word wasn't spoken aloud. No vocal cords moved. No tongue twisted it. But across the galaxy, from psionic empaths in the Ralzun temples to artificial minds orbiting neutron stars, everyone heard it. Not through sound, but through feeling. A cold ripple of sorrow, disbelief, and betrayal that sank deeper than thought and infected the soul like an old grief remembered too late. She lied. It wasn't a question. It was a fracture. Back in Argent Sanctuary, Miranda's vitals went wild. Brainwaves danced like static across a dying signal. Machines shrieked in alarm. Surgeons rushed into her stasis chamber, confused, unable to understand why the cryostasis was collapsing from the inside. But it wasn't her body breaking. It was her bond. In the moment Fluffy began to believe she had betrayed it, the entire emotional architecture that had kept it tethered to her, to humanity, to this plane of existence, shifted. At that exact moment, across 1,000 parsecs, the atmosphere on Supremacy Prime cracked like glass. The ritual had worked. The chain unbound stood triumphant in their subterranean vault, surrounding the pulsating clone of Miranda, a twisted hybrid of neural code and flesh, grown from stolen DNA and mirrored memories. They'd named it the False Mother, and it whispered all the right things. You were never loved. You were always a tool, a leash, a joke. But here's the thing the chain didn't anticipate. The Arkrell didn't respond with fury. Not at first. There was no cosmic scream, no apocalyptic discharge. There was just silence. Silence so total it blanketed the minds of psychics in the galactic core. Silence so pure it collapsed entire thought streams of collective AI cultures. For 27 minutes, not a single conscious being in the galaxy could dream. And then, one by one, the stars began to flicker. Not physically, not in any observable spectrum. No telescopes caught anomalies, but creatures with even the faintest hint of empathy began to report the same sensation. A presence, not moving through space, but through meaning. It wasn't fluffy anymore. The shell remained, the shimmering fur, the glowing blue eyes. But the gaze was different now. Not confused, not curious, empty. The Arkrell no longer knew what it was, and an identity crisis for a being that predates entropy was lethal. Deep within the galactic center, on the ancient world of Dorokal, a group of sentient plasma beings called the Velari had stored the last known record of a creature like the Arkrell. They called it Sumek Vale, the seed of collapse. It wasn't evil. It didn't rage. It simply unmade things. not by destroying them, but by convincing reality they had never been real in the first place. Entire constellations once vanished this way, not with fire, but with forgetting. That was the true nature of the Krell. It didn't kill you. It made your existence optional. Now this weapon of absolute unraveling had begun to question its own reason for existing, and that question rippled outward like a paradox grenade. Back on Earth, anomalies spread. Families forgot loved ones existed. Historical records began editing themselves. In a single Earth hour, 10% of all archived human data experienced loss of integrity collapse. Entire events, wars, elections, even planetary discoveries, blinked out of memory. No hacker could have done it. No virus. No quantum bug. It was the Krell's grief taking shape. Yet still, humanity resisted. At the center of Terran High Command, an emergency council was held. Ambassadors, generals, and scientists all screamed over one another, but only one voice cut through the madness. Admiral Raincore, Miranda's old protege. She alone had spent years watching the subtle signs, Fluffy's odd stillness, the background radiation readings that always spiked when Miranda smiled. The dreams she'd started having, the ones where Miranda wasn't Miranda anymore, but a voice holding back the dark. Core stood before the holodable and said the words no one dared. This isn't a pet. This is the final firewall. And we just broke it. Silence fell. She proposed the unthinkable. Send a ship directly into the echo-space rift forming above Cineros Prime. Not to attack, but to confront the false mother. To show the Krell it had not been abandoned, that Miranda's love wasn't fake, and that humanity chose this bond over and over again. A suicide mission. Perhaps. But what other choice did they have? So they built it. In 3 hours, an emerged prototype vessel, the Serenity Lance, was fitted with Miranda's complete consciousness record, harvested from backup wetware embedded in her command implant. It wasn't her, but it was close enough to speak her voice, carry her memories, mimic her love. They called the pilot construct Echo Miranda. She had one mission: reach Fluffy, reminded of who it is, or die trying. And as the Serenity Lance punched through quantum layers and streaked toward the forming rift, Fluffy, or rather, the thing inside it, looked up. It saw the ship, and for the first time in hours, it moved. Not with rage, not with confusion, but with hope. A ripple spread through the galactic mesh. The Krell remembered something. She lied. It wasn't a question. It was a fracture. Back in Argent Sanctuary, Miranda's vitals went wild. Brainwaves danced like static across a dying signal. Machines shrieked in alarm. Surgeons rushed into her stasis chamber, confused, unable to understand why the cryostasis was collapsing from the inside. But it wasn't her body breaking. It was her bond. In the moment, Fluffy began to believe she had betrayed it. The entire emotional architecture that had kept it tethered to her, to humanity, to this plane of existence, shifted. At that exact moment, across 1,000 parsecs, the atmosphere on Cineros Prime cracked like glass. The ritual had worked. The chain unbound stood triumphant in their subterranean vault, surrounding the pulsating clone of Miranda, a twisted hybrid of neural code and flesh grown from stolen DNA and mirrored memories. They'd named it the False Mother, and it whispered all the right things. You were never loved. You were always a tool, a leash, a joke. But here's the thing the chain didn't anticipate. The Krell didn't respond with fury. Not at first. There was no cosmic scream, no apocalyptic discharge. There was just silence. Silence so total it blanketed the minds of psychics in the galactic core. Silence so pure it collapsed entire thought streams of collective AI cultures. For 27 minutes, not a single conscious being in the galaxy could dream. And then, one by one, the stars began to flicker. Not physically, not in any observable spectrum, No telescopes caught anomalies, but creatures with even the faintest hint of empathy began to report the same sensation. A presence, not moving through space, but through meaning. It wasn't fluffy anymore. The shell remained, the shimmering fur, the glowing blue eyes. But the gaze was different now. Not confused, not curious. Empty. The Krell no longer knew what it was, and an identity crisis for a being that predates entropy was lethal. Deep within the galactic center, on the ancient world of Dorokal, a group of sentient plasma beings called the Velari had stored the last known record of a creature like the Krell. They called it Sumek, the seed of collapse. It wasn't evil. It didn't rage. It simply unmade things, not by destroying them, but by convincing reality they had never been real in the first place. Entire constellations once vanished this way, not with fire, but with forgetting. That was the true nature of the Krell. It didn't kill you. It made your existence optional. Now this weapon of absolute unraveling had begun to question its own reason for existing, and that question rippled outward like a paradox grenade. Back on Earth, anomalies spread. Families forgot loved ones existed. Historical records began editing themselves. In a single Earth hour, 10% of all archived human data experienced loss of integrity collapse. Entire events, wars, elections, even planetary discoveries, blinked out of memory. No hacker could have done it. No virus. No quantum bug. It was the Krell's grief taking shape. Yet still, humanity resisted. At the center of Terran High Command, an emergency council was held. Ambassadors, generals, and scientists all screamed over one another, but only one voice cut through the madness. Admiral Raincore, Miranda's old protege. She alone had spent years watching the subtle signs. Fluffy's odd stillness, the background radiation readings that always spiked when Miranda smiled, the dreams she'd started having, the ones where Miranda wasn't Miranda anymore, but a voice holding back the dark. Core stood before the holodeble and said the words no one dared. This isn't a pet. This is the final firewall, and we just broke it. Silence fell. She proposed the unthinkable. Send a ship directly into the echo-space rift forming above Ceneros Prime. Not to attack, but to confront the false mother. To show the Krell it had not been abandoned, that Miranda's love wasn't fake, and that humanity chose this bond over and over again. A suicide mission. Perhaps. But what other choice did they have? So they built it. In 3 hours, an I-merged prototype vessel, the Serenity Lance, was fitted with Miranda's complete consciousness record, harvested from backup wetware embedded in her command implant. It wasn't her, but it was close enough to speak her voice, carry her memories, mimic her love. They called the pilot construct Echo Miranda. She had one mission: reach Fluffy, reminded of who it is, or die trying. And as the Serenity Lance punched through quantum layers and streaked toward the forming rift, Fluffy, or rather, the thing inside it, looked up. It saw the ship, and for the first time in hours, it moved. Not with rage, not with confusion, but with hope. A ripple spread through the galactic mesh. The Krell remembered something. A voice, a laugh, a name. It whispered, Miranda. And in that whisper, reality paused. Because even gods can feel heartbreak. Even gods can hope. And hope is dangerous. The Serenity Lance pierced the veil of the rift, like a thought slicing through delusion. No thrusters fired, no engines roared. This was not flight in the traditional sense. This was navigation through belief, a course plotted not on charts, but through emotion and memory. The ship wasn't flying to Fluffy. It was becoming necessary to it. Reality had begun to bend around need. Inside the cockpit, Echo Miranda stood still, eyes closed, lips trembling with the weight of artificial emotion. She was a ghost made of light and loss, crafted from Miranda's deepest memories. voice patterns, and the thousands of micro-decisions that defined who she had been. The real Miranda still lay in cryostasis, unaware, fading, but Echo carried the feeling of her. And that was what mattered now. All around the lance, the rift churned like a living wound. Black lightning twisted through violet voids. Shards of forgotten timelines fluttered past the hull like dying butterflies, each one a reality that could have been, now cast aside by the unraveling that was Fluffy's grief. There were fragments of Earths that never existed, one where humanity never discovered fire, one where the oceans boiled and the continents floated as sky islands, one where Miranda herself never joined the Academy, instead living out a quiet life as a planetary botanist on Mars. All these versions of her, broken, rejected, made obsolete by Fluffy's unraveling psyche. And still, Echo Miranda pressed forward. Back on Xeneros Prime, the cult that called themselves the Chain Unbound began to celebrate too early. They thought the unraveling would spare them. They had flattered the Krell, fed it lies it wanted to hear, built monuments to its suffering. But they forgot one truth. The Krell was never driven by vanity. It was driven by connection. And now that connection had been fractured, it wasn't just reality unraveling. It was purpose itself. Around their fortress, physics began to misbehave. Metal wept. Fire froze. Screams arrived before mouths opened. Time surged and recoiled like a frightened animal. The chain realized too late. They hadn't made a god worship them. They had made a being without direction, and now its power lashed out blindly, seeking any path back to truth. And the truth was coming. Echo Miranda emerged from the rift into a realm that had no name. There was no space, no time, just a sensation, like standing on the edge of a thought you weren't meant to finish. And in that space floated Fluffy. Except it wasn't Fluffy anymore. Its form shifted second to second. A predator, a child, a storm, a silent cry for help. One moment it had eyes. The next it was nothing but void shaped like longing. All around it, flickers of Miranda's real memories played. Her voice reading star charts, laughing over bad coffee, whispering comfort after battle. But they were corrupted, fraying like old film reels left in the sun too long. Echo Miranda approached and spoke the first words into that collapsing realm. You weren't created to be a weapon. You were loved to be more than that. The creature recoiled, dimensions folding, screams without mouths erupting from non-existent lungs. You lied, it said, not in words, but in thunderous pulses of regret. You made me think I mattered. You did. You do. I'm not her, but I remember everything she felt. She never treated you like a pet, Fluffy. She chose you, even when they warned her, even when the others feared you. She stayed. The light dimmed around them. Entire galaxies stopped spinning in response to the quiet. And she's still here, Echo said softly. She's not gone. She's not fake. She's waiting. Fluffy stilled. The churning chaos slowed. For the first time, something like awareness flickered across its many shifting form. Waiting. Echo held out a hand, trembling but steady. Come back. Come home. A pause. Then Fluffy moved forward, not as a storm, but as a shape Miranda would recognize. The massive frame, the twitch of the ears, the electric shimmer beneath fur that smelled faintly of ozone and spring. And then it touched her hand. A flash of light. Not explosive, not violent, just pure, as if the universe itself remembered its own beginning. The rift began to collapse. All across the galaxy, anomalies vanished, records restored, memories clicked back into place. The unraveling halted. But more than that, something greater happened. Every being touched by the Krell's grief felt it shift. Not toward vengeance, not toward emptiness, toward peace. Back in the real world, aboard the Argent Sanctuary, Miranda gasped awake in her cryocamber, eyes wide, lungs drawing their first real breath in days. Her vitals stabilized instantly. no longer erratic, no longer fading. She whispered just one word, barely audible. Fluffy. And across the stars, in the heart of the lance, Fluffy turned toward the stars and began to come home. But not alone. For something had awoken in it, something new. Not power, not rage, but will. The will to choose love over oblivion. The will to protect humanity, not out of bond or leash, but belief. The galaxy would never be the same again. Because now, the deadliest creature in existence had a purpose, and it had chosen its side. The return was not instant. It was not dramatic in the traditional sense. There were no parades, no exploding stars, no triumphant fanfare echoing across solar systems. Instead, there was a silence, dense, aware, and sacred, as if the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting to see if what had happened was real. The Serenity Lance emerged from the collapsed rift, not as it once was. Its hull bore fractal scars from alternate realities stitched back together. It shimmered faintly with chronomatter, residue from places that had never existed. But it held. More than that, it endured. The vessel had crossed through a being's grief and returned whole. And standing silently on its observation deck was Fluffy. Not snarling, not shifting. Still, gone was the storm of chaos that once defined the Arkrell. In its place stood a creature finally aware of its own heart. Its massive frame loomed like a myth reawakened, fur flowing like starlight, eyes no longer chaotic voids, but shimmering with a gentle glow, golden, soft, thoughtful. Echo Miranda, though only a projection of code and memory, watched the beast with something eerily close to awe. It wasn't just alive. It was awake, fully, not reacting, but deciding. And its first decision was mercy. Xenaros Prime, ground zero of the unraveling, once overrun by the cult of the Chain Unbound, now stood in stunned paralysis. The Order's Grand Archmind, Lord Vexine, had once promised his followers that ascension came through submission to the Arkrell, that if they bent the knee, Fluffy would spare them when the universe was reset in his sorrow-fueled image. He was wrong. The sky split above the cultist fortress, not with fire, but with presence. Fluffy descended through atmosphere not on wings or engines, but carried by intention alone. Gravity bent for him. Time slowed out of respect. And every cultist felt something they never expected. Understanding. Fluffy didn't destroy them. He didn't roar. He didn't lash out. Instead, he stood silently above them and remembered. He projected their own pasts back into their minds. The lies they told, the desperate reasons they believed them, the truths they tried to bury in ritual and worship. He showed them the harm they'd caused and the pain that gave rise to it. It was not punishment. It was clarity. And as thousands wept, broken by the weight of their own misdeeds, Fluffy turned and vanished, leaving only one phrase etched into the stone walls of their fortress, carved not by claw or fire, but intention. Even gods grieve. Meanwhile, across the galactic core, the High Confederacy convened in secret. Leaders, warlords, artificial minds, and post-biological sages, all trying to understand the new paradigm. A being once thought uncontrollable now wielded restraint. A creature classified as an extinction-tier threat now moved like a philosopher. "What do we do?" someone asked. The answer came from an unlikely voice, an old war veteran named Commander Varric, once stationed on Earth's outer defense ring. "We don't do anything," he said, leaning back in his grav chair. "We wait, and we remember who tamed him first." The room fell into hushed silence, because they all knew what he meant. Miranda. She had returned to active consciousness days after the Lance's re-entry. She was thinner, weaker, but her eyes burned with renewed strength. She refused reassignment, refused isolation. All she asked for was to see him again. When they were finally reunited aboard the orbital station Elias Red, The meeting didn't go as expected. There were no explosions, no psychic storms. Just Miranda, stepping onto the deck, limping, breath ragged, and Fluffy waiting at the far end, still as stone. And then she smiled. Fluffy approached slowly, cautiously, like an animal afraid of breaking something fragile. But she reached out and rested her hand gently on his muzzle. "You waited," she whispered, voice trembling with memory. He lowered his head. "You came back," she added, tears falling. A silence hung in the air. Then Fluffy did something unthinkable. He bowed, not out of submission, but out of respect. And every sensor, every recording device across the station picked it up. The most dangerous creature in the known galaxy, a being born from weaponized grief, had bowed to a human. The news spread like wildfire, across military channels, across civilian nets, through smuggler guilds, pirate fleets, ancient as. The message echoed through every fringe and core world. The Krell bows only once, and it bowed to her. The implications were staggering. Nations reeled. Religions fractured. Warlords panicked. Because if this thing, this godkiller, could be tamed not by force, but by compassion, what did that mean for their empires of fear? The concept of strength itself began to shift. And yet, in the shadows of all this hope, darker minds began to stir. Not everyone wanted peace. In the asteroid halls of the vanished court, an ancient faction stirred. Long thought destroyed, they had once attempted to create their own version of the Krell. A weapon without empathy, a beast without connection. Their experiments had failed, catastrophically. But now, they had proof that such power could be awakened and directed. They didn't see a redeemed creature. They saw a blueprint. And in the dark, a voice whispered, "If one was born from love, another can be born from hate." The game was changing. Fluffy was no longer a monster. He was a symbol. But symbols inspire. And sometimes, they awaken nightmares of their own. The stars had barely begun to recover from the legend of the Krell's return when another disturbance shattered the fragile calm. It began at the edge of known space, in the antric void, a cold, lightless expanse untouched by civilization for 1,000 years. Sensor buoys placed there long ago by humanity's exploratory corps began transmitting impossible data. Fluctuations in background radiation, unmapped gravitational anomalies, and most disturbingly, the sound of breathing. Yes, sound, where none should exist. At first, the scientific community dismissed it as phantom data, a side effect of damaged probes or the decaying effects of chronometric drift. But then came the visual, a shape, enormous, coiled, organic, but with the precision of engineered machinery. A pulse rippled across its surface, dark as a dead star, and then it vanished into hyperspace, not blinking or warping, but sliding out of reality like oil slipping beneath water. The creature was unlike Fluffy in every way, and yet, it shared something horrifyingly familiar. And then came the whisper, across psychic relays, dreamscapes, and coded signals hijacked in the deep black, born of betrayal, fed by fear, perfected through pain. Someone, or something, had succeeded where others failed. They had created a counter-Krell, and it was coming. While humanity reeled from this revelation, Miranda stood at the heart of the Serenity Lance, watching the stars shift in the distance. Her link to Fluffy had deepened since their reunion. She didn't control him, but she understood him. More importantly, he understood her. And when the echo of that voice reached them both, she didn't flinch. Because Fluffy did something no one expected. He growled, not in fury, not in grief, but in warning. He knew what it was, not just an instinct, but memory. It was a remnant of the same experimental protocols that birthed his species, a theoretical second core that had been cut from the program after it proved unstable, too violent, too mindless. But someone had reactivated it. And worse, they had given it purpose. It was known as Xerx, a creature designed to exceed Fluffy in raw aggression and savagery, but without the burden of emotion. No capacity for bonding, no hesitation, only obedience to annihilation. And now it was hunting. Not for planets, not for armies, for Fluffy. Across the star lanes, war erupted, not between nations, but between ideologies. Some factions rallied to protect Fluffy, viewing him as a cosmic turning point, a sacred protector. Others sought to turn him in, trade him for mercy from Xerx, hoping to survive the inevitable reckoning. Aboard the warship Celestial Crown, Commander Varric received a message from one such faction, a splinter group of the High Confederacy, calling themselves the Crimson Accord. They offered coordinates to what they claimed was Xerx's gestation lair. But it was a trap. Miranda knew it before the data even finished uploading. Xerx didn't build lairs. It was always moving, always evolving. The trap wasn't for Fluffy. It was for her. And yet, she went anyway. Because she knew the truth now. Fluffy was never meant to fight alone. She was the counterbalance, his tether to sanity. The proof that the deadliest creature in the galaxy didn't need chains, weapons, or biocollars to be kept in check. Just trust. The moment she entered the designated coordinates, space tore open, not like a wound, but like a scream made manifest. Xerx emerged. Not just bigger than Fluffy, but colder. Its body was an amalgam of synthetic sinew, molten armor, and shadows that writhed like sentient smoke. Its eyes were hollow voids that consumed light. Unlike Fluffy's emotive, organic movement, Xerx pulsed like a virus given shape. It didn't attack Miranda. It studied her, and then it projected a memory. Her memory of the moment she first held Fluffy as a cub, of the bond that formed without force or training. A moment of purity, now mocked. Emotion is weakness, the creature said through thousands of digital voices. You mistake restraint for weakness, she replied. Xerx's maw opened and screamed, not in sound, but through the minds of every living thing in a 10-light-year radius. The stars dimmed, space itself recoiled. But before the scream could rupture her very cells, Fluffy arrived, not in silence, not in fury, but in full clarity. And for the first time in galactic history, two Krell met. The confrontation was not a battle of claws and teeth, it was a war of existence. Xerx struck like entropy incarnate, each movement threatening to erase reality around him. But Fluffy fought like a being who had seen death, survived grief, and learned to choose. Every strike was measured, every motion intentional. They clashed across worlds. Moons shattered beneath their steps, nebulae twisted in their wake. And then, it happened. Xerx pinned Fluffy beneath a spiraled tendril of anti-energy, preparing the final strike. But before it could land, Miranda stepped between them. She placed her hand on Xerx's chest. It recoiled, not from pain, but from something unfamiliar. Human touch, empathy. She whispered, "You were made without it, but that doesn't mean you have to die without it." And for a brief instant, Xerx hesitated. That hesitation was everything. Fluffy rose, and with a silent pulse, unleashed not a roar, not an attack, but a memory. A single thread of thought, projected from him to Xerx. It was of Miranda, cradling a frightened cub, feeding it, naming it, loving it, and in that moment, Xerx broke, not from damage, but from possibility. It collapsed inward, not destroyed, but transformed. The dark shell cracked, the rage drained, and what remained was silence. A cosmic predator had become a lost child. Miranda caught it in her arms as its form shrank, coalesced into something smaller, more manageable. A creature not unlike Fluffy in his infancy, and Fluffy, towering beside her, simply sat, watching, guarding. Not a weapon, not a beast, a guardian. And from that moment forward, the universe changed. Because the galaxy finally learned a truth humanity had always known. The deadliest creatures aren't always monsters. Sometimes, they're just misunderstood. And sometimes, they're just pets. But to those who threaten what they love, they are extinction. So next time you hear tales of terror from the deep dark, remember this. The monster you're afraid of might just be a human's best friend. If you enjoyed this tale of cosmic redemption, ancient secrets, and beastly guardianship, hit that like button. Share this with your fellow starfarers, and subscribe to StarBoundApex HFY for more interstellar legends and humanity's greatest moments in the stars. And now we leave you with a question. If humanity can tame the deadliest creature in the galaxy, what else are we capable of? Let us know in the comments below. We'll be watching the stars and waiting.